So recently I received this cute little book from a friend of mine, and while I was looking it through, I realized that it wasn't finished. I know for sure that the person that gave it to me is still in the middle of his language learning journey, but it just made me realize that this book was probably not a good fit for his current language skills. Which brings us exactly to the topic of today's video. This is the guide for strategically choosing a book to read with whatever language skill you have, so that your language learning journey becomes more productive, more effective, and just more enjoyable. So, the first and foremost that you need to understand about choosing a book to read is that if it is earlier than mid 20th century, it is going to be tough on you unless you are super proficient, super fluent, speaking almost like a native. The older the book is, the more sophisticated, the more overwhelming the vocabulary feels. And while this sounds like an obvious point, I pretty often see people starting to learn Russian with Dostoevsky or starting to learn English with Jane Austen, but I should say this is a very, very wrong pick from the motivation perspective because it may affect your motivation so badly going through something that is too challenging early on in the process. So, the obvious conclusion that we might get is that it is better to start with things that you know pretty well. Think of it as picking a movie to watch during holiday season. You don't want something difficult, you want something cozy and something that is very familiar to you. And always remember the previous point, it should be modern. So in my case, my go-to is Harry Potter. I have it in English, I have it in French and in Spanish, and it makes sense because I've seen the movie several times, I've read books in Russian, and it's pretty easy for me to figure out the meaning of the words and phrases just because I very often know for sure what happens in that particular chapter, in that particular scene of the book. Another thing that I want to point out is don't delude yourself into thinking that kids' literature is going to be interesting for you. It won't. But it won't hurt to try either, so you do you. But if you feel that taking a book that is intended for teens or for adults is too complicated, too uncomfortable for you yet, I would suggest focusing on grammar, on some vocabulary first, separately from the books, and only after that go for some reading. Because in my experience, going into reading a bit too early on in the process may affect your motivation badly, and you just shouldn't bite what you can't chew, and also you shouldn't bite yourself for that either. My next point concerns translation. If you consider yourself a beginner or an intermediate learner, or maybe upper intermediate but definitely not advanced, I would say translation over original pieces. It is like a motto for some time until you get more fluent. Because translated books are usually a lighter read than the books that were originally written in that language. Translation is usually done by pretty qualified people, so you don't really sacrifice the quality of the book in that case, but you save yourself some nerve cells. Plus, remember to take modern literature. It's almost a mantra by now. So recently I read this book by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I'm not sure if I pronounced the name correctly, but the book was amazing. And from the translation point, I noticed that some words were repeated throughout the book over and over again. I'm not sure if that was the case in the original piece, but it is definitely a good thing to see in translation that certain words get repeated over and over again because it helps to memorize them. And we don't really look at the books from the literature point of view right now. We are trying to figure out which is going to be the most productive yet still enjoyable to read. And the last point that I wanted to say wasn't that obvious for me until pretty recently. Don't be fooled by comic books or manga. They may look like an easier read just because there are images all over the place, but They may contain some very, very strong slang, and the author may be throwing grammar over his shoulder over and over again without any regret. In my experience, reading DuckTales comic books was almost like reading Jane Austen from the difficulty perspective, but of course, the reasons for my struggles were different. Now that we have realized what types of books we should go for, here are some essential moments that you need to pay attention to in order to make your reading experience not only pleasurable but also productive. If you understand around 70% of words or more, but you can't really make sense of the thing that you are reading, the problem is in grammar, not in lack of vocabulary knowledge. I have a story in my experience, which was when I was reading Stories by Neil Gaiman and Al Sarrantonio. It was a really cool book. I enjoyed most of the stories when I was finally able to read them. But when I first purchased the book and I opened it, I saw that most of the words were familiar to me as I have already read a bunch of books, not only Harry Potter, but more complicated ones. But anyway, when I was looking at words, I realized that I understand the meaning of the word, but seems like I was missing the point. So I abandoned the idea of reading this book for about a year, and during that time, I was intensively studying for my university entrance exams, which included some more advanced grammar than what we can see in the regular school textbooks. Later on, when about a year passed and I randomly opened this book, it was to my surprise that I found out that I understand almost 100% of what I was reading. It was a shocking experience for me because earlier I didn't understand that the issue was with grammar, not with vocabulary. Generally, there are several types of reading for language learning purposes, so choose wisely, because your experience depends a lot on which approach you chose. The first one is super intensive. It is when you go over each sentence with ChatGPT, for example, like I use the prompt translate and explain each word in the sentence. It gives you a lot of useful information, not only about the vocabulary, but also about grammar, because it explains how the words in the sentence are connected. This is highly effective, but it always comes with the drawbacks, right? And the thing is that it is too slow if you wish to enjoy the reading process. So this option is not recommended for those who easily lose that motivation spark. Another one is postponed intensive. It is when you write out all the words and phrases that you don't understand to later on look them up and study them more closely. Faster than the previous option, but the main risk is that if you tend to give up on commitments, you can easily just forget to do the studying itself later on, and these words will be left unattended. The good news, though, is that you'll probably remember bits and pieces anyway, so perhaps it is still worth doing even if you're terrible at disciplining yourself. And the last option here is passive learning. It is when you read without any interruptions, even if you come across words that you don't understand. This is by far the fastest and the most enjoyable option, but it only becomes available starting from a certain level of language skill. And while, for example, for English, it may be available at earlier stages, for languages with higher entry barrier like Chinese, it may be available only at much later stages. But even if your level does not allow you to go fully into passive reading right now, it's a great thing to look forward to, because this experience of reading without the need to consult a vocabulary file or ChatGPT is unmatched. It means you can immerse yourself into the world of the chosen book and advance in your language learning at the same time. It's an amazing feeling, actually. So, what are your book recommendations for languages that you are learning or you're already proficient in? I'm mostly interested in English, French, Chinese, Mandarin, and Japanese if you ask, but I guess any language would be useful because there are other people in the comments, and so all language book recommendations are welcome. Thanks a lot, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video. I'm really thankful that you watched this till the end. Love you!